Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Battle for Azeroth class review. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Shaman, and once you're done with this video, you should check out today's sponsor, Icy Veins. They are the largest destination for World of Warcraft class guides and content, and they have recently hired 26 writers for BFA, and the BFA guides, they're all up right now. I recommend checking them out. You can get up to speed with all the class changes and pick up whatever class you want. So, a massive thank you to them, check them out, and let's get right into the video. And we're starting this one off with Restoration, which was one of my favorite Legion healers. I love the feeling of its tidal wave mechanic, and it just had a remarkably broad and effective toolkit. For whatever reason, I just felt really powerful and capable with Restoration. It was super strong Legion, I think, with gameplay that was really popular with players, so let's go and see what BFA does to the formula. First, let's kick it off with the baseline gameplay. So, we're going to start it off with Healing Surge and Healing Wave. These guys follow the traditional pattern where Healing Wave is slow, but it's mana efficient. Healing Surge is fast, but it's mana inefficient. The only difference with BFA is that Healing Wave now actually heals for a little bit more than Healing Surge, which is in line with changes to other basic heals for other specs. For an example, with the Paladin's Holy Light and Flash of Light, where the Holy Light heals for slightly more than the Flash. So, these two spells are fine, but they don't exist in isolation because we also have Riptide. This is an instant heal and a 6-second cooldown that leaves a hot on the target. And the last thing that I want to cover before we get really hyped for tidal waves is Chain Heal. It is a beam of healing. It jumps to up to 4 players from its initial one, with the healing decreasing by 30% every time that it jumps. It's got no cooldowns, so if you want to delete your mana bar to keep your team alive, well, this one will certainly get the job done. Now, here's the hype thing, because both Chain Heal and Riptide trigger tidal waves, which is a passive effect that unifies this spec's healing toolkit. Casting either Chain Heal or Riptide will reduce the cast time of your next healing wave by 30% or increase the crit chance of your next healing surge by 40%, and this effect stacks up to 2 times. Now, this makes healing wave a bit faster, and it makes healing surge heal for a lot more, assuming you get a crit. Now, technically speaking, the loss of the artifact does impact this, because Queen's Ascendant used to significantly increase your haste and also increase your crit with several of its traits. Now, some of those can be reclaimed in talents, but this does mean that the spec feels a little bit slower to play. We also, of course, lose our artifact ability baseline, though it has been added back into the talent tree. And yeah, let's just round off the rest of the toolkit. So Healing Rain is the handy healing circle on the floor, which is nice and efficient. And come on, guys, be sure to stand in it. And also, if you're a healer, be sure to place it somewhere that's handy. We then got Healing Stream Totem that will heal injured allies around it every 2 seconds for 15 seconds. And as you can see just with this, we've got a strong mix of single target and AoE heals, as well as a little bit of burst healing potential through a tidal waved healing surge. However, the crits are a bit less guaranteed because of the loss of those artifact traits, which does make it a little bit less reliable. Now, we then do have some big juicy cooldowns. We've got Healing Tide Totem, which is your big group-wide AoE heal, and then we've got Spirit Link Totem, and this one's a little bit different from the norm. So first, it reduces the damage taken by everyone within 10 yards by 10%, but then it redistributes health such that everyone is on the same health percentage. Now, this is amazing because of how it applies to different situations. If everyone is getting hammered, then it will control the loss of health, such that it'll take longer for players to drop off overall, which gives your team more time to save people. But if one person's about to be hammered, you can use this to spread the damage amongst other players. It's an amazing, amazing cooldown when combined with other healing cooldowns and personal damage cooldowns, and it's just such a cool design. Past that, we've got great utility with the now baseline Capacitor Totem, and for a complete look, of course, just hit up the Icy Veins spell guide section. But let's just go and check out the rest of the talents. So there have been a few talent removals which kind of sting, right? We no longer have Gust of Wind, which was lovely for movement, and it has been replaced with Nature's Guardian, which itself is quite nice, but the movement loss again kind of stings. Also, Ancestral Guidance was removed and then replaced with Earth Shield, and this severely hurts the burst healing capabilities, as it was commonly used along with Cloudburst Totem and Ascendance for some really extreme burst healing. But we do see some reshuffling then with the talents and some powerful new options which have been reduced. So Downpour is now in the 90 tier, and that of course is our artifact weapon from Legion, so if you want that back, you can have it, though you are going to have to choose between it and Cloudburst Totem, which has a new synergy in Battle for Azeroth, and then of course Flash Flood, which is a new talent that causes consuming a tidal wave to decrease the cast time of your next spell by 20%, which is similar enough to the artifact trait cast time reduction that you had. And choosing between these is kind of tricky because both Flash Flood and Downpour feel like great general picks, and then Cloud Burst Totem is a super interesting mechanic. So what it does is it replaces Healing Stream Totem. Whenever you place it, it will begin to count up the amount of healing that you do. Whenever it expires after 15 seconds, or whenever you hit its button again, it will release 25% of all of your healing done over its duration as an AoE heal between all injured allies in 40 yards. Now this is super interesting because it lets you prep for a period of heavy damage, and what's even more cool is that in BFA, Echo of the Elements gives you 2 charges of Healing Stream Totem. So if you talent into Cloudburst, which replaces Stream, then you've got 2 charges of Cloudburst, and this greatly reduces the chance of risking it, meaning that you can pretty much always have one of them rolling. Now, it might not be the best fit for all situations, but I think it's an innovative bit of gameplay that has the benefit of synergizing with really every other heal in your toolkit, and I think is a little bit better in BFA because of that Echo of the Elements synergy. Now, as for other talents, well, Earth Shield is new, increases your healing of the target by 10% and heals them whenever they take damage. Then Nature's Guardian will instantly heal you for 20% of your max health whenever you fall below 35% health. Static Charge is a cooldown reduction to your Capacitor Totem based on how many enemies it stuns. Spirit Wolf gives you a stacking damage taken reduction and move speed increase that will reach 20% after 4 seconds for both of those things. So that's the core of the new changes. So I'm going to round this off by just calling out some of my favorite talents. So I think Undulation is really cool. It makes every third healing wave or surge heal for an additional 50%. So that can be a fun little side mechanic to keep track of and then use. Ascendance is a pretty cool healing cooldown as well, and Wellspring is a really fun frontal cone heal that's pretty powerful, and it's got a 20-second cooldown, which means that it's going to be lining up with an Echo of the Elemented Cloudburst Totem quite nicely, giving you a significant healing potential from that. So that's it for the talents. Overall, a pretty damn robust selection of things, so let's just talk about the overall thoughts. And really, Restoration continues to be a very enjoyable spec for me. Battle for Azeroth has not messed around with the formula too much, except the removal, of course, of Artifact Weapon, which did make the spec feel a little bit better with those effects being baseline, so whilst it's good to see them as talents, I would rather they were just baked into the spec by default, such that we would have room on the talent tree for some other things. And they are still on the weaker side for high-end Mythic Plus, but that likely won't impact me that much, but probably is worth taking into consideration if you're really interested in that. On paper, I suppose we do see sort of a downgrade because of some of those mechanics, but it still is a very, very enjoyable spec. Now, unfortunately, Azerite trades don't seem to be adding much within the scope of Uldir, so it's definitely worth hoping that Ashara's Rage starts to ramp up the effects of the Azerite system. So, to be clear, this is one of my top healers, absolutely. One or two little downsides of BFA, but a few upsides as well. Overall, it still is coming out being fantastic, though. And next up, we've got Elemental, and it is another case of not being massive on paper in terms of its changes, but being quite noticeable in real-world scenarios. So let's get right into it with the baseline stuff. So we don't see a lot of abilities being outright removed, but what we do see is a lot of the rebalancing of resources. Now, this is a builder-spender spec, and that means the changes to its resource mechanics heavily impact how it feels to play. Now, Flame Shock has got a 6-second cooldown, it's got an 18-second duration, but it doesn't cost Maelstrom, which is a simplification over Legion. Now, the main changes in this spec are found with our Maelstrom generation and spending, and to cut a long story short, Maelstrom generation is down across the board. Earthshock, your single target spender, is now less expensive, but Earthquake, your AoE spender, is more expensive, which slows the pace of the spec down in AoE. Now, concerning other changes, well, our Fire Elemental now causes Flame Shock ticks to generate through Maelstrom, which is great, but the Elemental now lasts 30 seconds, down from 1 minute, and has a 2.5 minute cooldown. A pretty good change that makes it interact with a resource mechanic, I suppose. Now, one somewhat puzzling removal is Elemental Focus. Now, this caused the direct damage crits that you did to increase the damage of your next healing or damage spells by 10%, your next 2. Now, this added a bit more of skill cap to the spec, because Lava Burst always crits if it hits a flame-shocked target, which would mean this was a reliable effect that you could play around. And to be honest, I'm quite sad that Blizzard have simplified the spec by removing this, as it does just lose some depth in the basic rotation for me. Then next, Tremor Totem, which removes sleeps, charms, and fears, has been added, as has a Lightning Surge Totem, which is baseline for the class. And then, of course, we have lost our artifact weapon, though Stormkeeper does, I mean, a version of Stormkeeper exists in the talents to fill that gameplay niche in the 100 tier. So that's pretty much it for the baseline changes, though, but we just really need to talk about the gameplay repercussions here. So Elemental is all about firing off big chunks of lava and loads of lightning. It looks and it feels fantastic from a visual perspective, and it's got a few quirks that separate it from other casters. It's a builder spender spec that uses a resource called Maelstrom. Your basic abilities generate Maelstrom, and then you funnel that either into single target or AoE spenders. So what are our generators? Well, the most simple one is Lightning Bolt. It does low damage and it generates 8 Maelstrom. We then have Lava Burst, which does middling damage normally, and it generates 10 Maelstrom, but importantly, it always crits if it's used against a flame-shocked target. And then ticks of Flame Shock have a 15% chance to trigger Lava Surge, which resets the cooldown of Lava Burst and makes it instant. Then Flame Shock is a simple damage over time effect, so in single target you maintain your Flame Shock, you use Lava Burst on cooldown, and use Lightning Bolts as your filler. And then of course you channel your Maelstrom. Now this goes into either two places, and it's really simple. If it's single target, we're using Earth Shock, it costs 60 Maelstrom and it does heavy damage. Now things are slightly different in AoE because that's when we switch over to using Chain Lightning as our filler, and instead of using Earth Shock we cast a spell called Earthquake, which does strong damage in an area over 6 seconds. Now our Mastery Elemental Overload then affects Maelstrom generation, giving Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning the ability to pretty much fire off again, dealing additional damage and generating even more Maelstrom. Now that is the core of how this spec works. It is somewhat predictable and straightforward, but it has decreased Maelstrom generation across the board and the loss of elemental focus, which slows the spec down and removes a bit of the top end of its gameplay. So with that covered, let's just talk about the talents. So quite a few talents have been removed or changed. Voodoo Totem and Gust of Wind, which were bits of utility, they are now gone. Regarding throughput talents, Lightning Rod is gone, as is Path of Flame, Elemental Fusion, and Ancestral Swiftness. Then Aftershock has been redesigned to be a bit more bursty. Previously, it refunded 30% of Maelstrom spent overall, whereas now spells have a 25% chance to refund all of the Maelstrom spent on, the spell itself. Now, this of course does open up room for new toys, so let's go and see what Blizzard have given us. Now, Exposed Elements is quite cool. It causes Earthshock to increase the damage of your next Lightning Bolt on the target by 75%. Then in the second row, we've got Master of the Elements. This causes Lava Burst to increase the damage of your next Nature or Frost spell by 20%. Now, this gets pretty cool, and one nice thing that I notice is you get the buff upon casting, not upon the projectile hitting, which does feel a lot better. So, Lava Bursting into an Earthshock would deal for very heavy damage, and if you also had, say, Exposed Elements, then that would also maybe lead you right into a buffed up Lightning Bolt. Now, this would be excellent with Frost Shock if you were taking the Ice Fury talent, which increases the damage of your next 4 Frost Shocks by 100%, so you'd be doubling up the damage and then adding 20% on for Master of the Elements. This would be pretty cool as a synergy, but right now, Totem Mastery, an existing Legion talent, I believe, is dominating the second row. It gives you a bunch of passive buffs, and it's impossible to use it wrong, and it's good in all situations, so it's kind of hard not to pick it for this spec. Now moving on to 45, Spirit Wolf makes your Ghost Wolf quickly ramp up 20% damage reduction and move speed. Well, not quickly, it's over 4 seconds, but it's quite nice anyway. Then in the 60 tier, we go back to gameplay with High Voltage, which is a new talent that gives Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning a 50% extra chance to Elemental Overload, so free damage, free resources, faster pace. Now currently in pre-patch, it's great because we've got High Mastery with all of our Legion gear, but it may not be as amazing at the start of BFA at level 120. So once you're at level 120, maybe you're going with your Storm Elemental, which will replace your Fire Elemental, and it's got the cool effect of giving you a stacking cast time decrease to your Lightning Bolt and your Chain Lightning that feels pretty nice to use. Then on the 100 tier, we have 2 new talents, Stormkeeper and Unlimited Power. Stormkeeper is a weaker version of your artifact weapon ability. It only affects the next 2 Lightning Bolts and Chain Lightnings, and it ensures Elemental Overload instead of the previous one, which would do 200% extra damage. Then we've got Unlimited Power. This gives you 2% haste for every 10 seconds whenever an ability Elemental Overloads. It stacks, but the stacks do not refresh the duration. This means that every 10 seconds or so, you kind of fluctuate greatly in haste, potentially by quite some margin, especially if you're in AoE, and therefore are getting loads of Elemental elemental overloads from your chain lightnings. Now, this works fantastically with a high voltage talent, as high voltage increases the chance of your elemental overload by 50%. So, there you go, that's the talent situation. Let's round it off with opinions. And taking a broad look at things, I guess I do find this to be a decently fun pick-up and play spec. It's a little bit on the simple side, and that can get dull over time, and that's really the issue. Now, this is somewhat more of a problem in Battle for Azeroth because of the decreased resource generation and the removal of the elemental focus passive, which added a bit of top end to playing this spec that was quite enjoyable. Now, I do like some of the new talents, especially Master of the Elements. However, the talent tree currently suffers from being quite unbalanced in pre-patch, plus Totem Mastery is, it's thematically strong and very powerful, but it's not that interactive, and therefore I think it's kind of boring. Now, the core problem is that certain talents on rows work extremely well together, and that kind of pigeonholes you into certain builds. As an example, choosing high voltage and unlimited power together. This has the benefit of being a really satisfying combination, but it also is potentially so strong that it effectively moves choice in both talent tiers. Now, I do wish that elemental focus was still a part of this spec, and I kind of wish that Echo of the Elements, which gives Lava Burst 2 charges, I just wish that was baseline. I especially think that Echo of the Elements would go great with a version of the Master of the Elements talent that was perhaps a stacking buff. So maybe that's something Blizzard could look into for patch 8.1. Overall, though, the transition to BFA has been kind of mixed, and I'm looking forward to what they do in 8.1 to maybe increase the pace of this, and yeah, just change up some of the gripes that I've got, especially with the Maelstrom generation and the pace. Okay, next, it's Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement was strange to me in Legion. It had great highlight moments, like using Doom Winds, getting a massive Storm Strike chain, and plus the awesome Crash Lightning, but outside of that, spec never really grabbed me. It was a bit too reliant on random mechanics for my tastes, and BFA's real rough for this one, so let's just get right into it. Okay, let's talk about the baseline changes, and really, the changes to this spec, they are just puzzling. So, our Maelstrom cap has decreased from 150 to 100. This makes resource pooling harder, and that is tricky because of other changes. So, Lava Lash, which is technically a filler spell, has had its Maelstrom cost increased to 40, but its damage increased as well. Now, previously it would cost 20% of your Maelstrom bar, but now it costs 40% of your bar. This makes it quite a bit less flexible in its usage. Now, because of the passive Maelstrom generation, it means you can use this 3 times back-to-back to burn off excess Maelstrom, which you're going to have a lot of because of Storm Strike stuff. So Storm Strike has had its Maelstrom cost reduced to 30, but the critical change is that Stormbringer now makes your next Storm Strike free, whereas previously it would cost 50% as much with Stormbringer. Now, this creates a situation where it feels impossible to spend Maelstrom that you're generating, and that leads to you overcapping it. This is a problem that's greatly exaggerated by the Maelstrom cap being 100 down from 150, and it almost reminds me of the Havoc Demon Hunter situation where they felt terrible with a Fury cap of 100, leading to Blizzard increasing that to 120, which is enough to use their main spender back-to-back 3 to 4 times. Something similar would be a fantastic quick fix to this spec, which right now contends with a lot of resource wastage, even when played well, and that's just really unsatisfying. But we do see one positive change. Crash Lightning now increases the damage of your next Storm Strike by 5%. And the other significant loss, though, is your Doomhammer artifact ability. This was super powerful, 1 minute cooldown, required a bit of planning to actually pull off, and it provided this great medium-term gameplay loop that has now been removed, and I think that makes the spec less engaging. Then Earth Elemental's baseline, as is Cap Totem and Tremor Totem. So that's the critical changes, but really, to get into this, we just need to talk about the baseline gameplay. So on face value, the gameplay is highly similar. The specs operate in a similar enough manner. If you're used to it, it'll be very familiar. However, the feel of the spec is significantly changed because of these rebalanced ability costs with the Maelstrom cap and the Maelstrom generation. The basic gameplay is still the same though, so you're using Rockbiter to generate Maelstrom, then you're using Storm Strike on cooldown. It of course does heavy damage, and it can trigger, stuff can trigger Stormbringer, which will immediately reset its cooldown and make its next cast free and deal 25% more damage, and Wind Fury, which causes your main hand attacks to trigger extra attacks. Of course, these attacks then play into a passive called Maelstrom Weapon, which causes your auto attacks and your Wind Fury attacks to generate 5 Maelstrom, and all of this means that generally you've got a lot of Maelstrom, but of course a lower cap and it's harder to spend Maelstrom because of Stormbringered Storm Strikes being free instead of costing 20 Maelstrom, and therefore taking you down your bar in Legion. Now in AoE, you'll be mixing in Crash Lightning, which is another excellent ability to use. If you hit 2 more targets, it'll empower your next Storm Strike and Lava Lash to do extra damage to all targets in front of you for 10 seconds, and for every enemy hit by Crash Lightning, the damage of your next Storm Strike is increased. Now, that nature damage from Storm Strike and Lava Lash is actually worth keeping up in a single target scenario, so if you're able to hit a second enemy with it, it's actually worth doing this, even if like single target DPS is your main priority. Now, every time it hits an enemy, that counts as an attack that can Stormbringer and Wind Fury, so while Crash Lightning may seem simple, it is actually a little bit more involved in the minutiae of its usage. Then finally, we've got Flame Tongue, which is a buff to maintain, doesn't really do too much else. So let's cover passives. Now, Stormbringer, as I mentioned, gives you a chance to trigger a free Storm Strike and to reset the cooldown of Storm Strike. Now, it triggers off all attacks, meaning the dual-handed attacks like Storm Strike actually give you 2 chances for it to trigger. Then we've got Wind Fury, which gives your main hand attacks a chance to trigger 2 extra attacks, and Maelstrom Weapon, which gives us 5 Maelstrom per auto attack or Wind Fury attack. And this can lead to big spikes in our resource generation. So there you go, that's the baseline gameplay. Let's talk about the talents. Really, quite a lot has happened with the talents to this spec, and one recurring theme is Maelstrom generation. So as I covered, we already contend with a lot of resource wastage problems on this spec, so when the talents give us even more resources, it just doesn't feel good. Now, oddly enough, the new talents don't have much of an impact on the core gameplay. Now, Totem Mastery, of course, just gives us some passives. Searing Assault is just a dot. Elemental Spirits is just a buff to your Feral Spirit DPS cooldown. There's really nothing super groundbreaking there, so I just want to cover or call out some of the more impactful changes, some of which are quite good. So, Forceful Winds causes each successive Wind Fury attack within 15 seconds to increase the damage of Wind Fury and the Maelstrom generated by 1, and that stacks up to 5 times. Now, Crash Lightning synergizes brilliantly with this because its initial hits can trigger Wind Fury, and that rapidly builds up stacks of the buff. Then Sundering is a lot more powerful, and because of its positional gameplay, I think it's quite fun to use. This is a change from Legion due to how it operates in the back end, and it's a very welcome change. Thankfully, it also spends Maelstrom, which is very welcome in how this spec currently is. Then with the 100 tier, Ascendance is still a great, strong general cooldown. Elemental Spirit gives you, more Spirit Wolves, and it's not really that interactive. And finally, Earthen Spike is a single target attack on a 20-second cooldown that makes the target take increased nature and physical damage for 10 seconds, which gives you a pretty reliable damage window that you can play into. To be honest, I'm not really sure what to call out here, as it's all pretty similar and not tremendously impactful, bar giving you some nice passives and extra buttons, examples like Sundering and Earthen Spike. Landslide has actually been changed though. It no longer gives you a buff to maintain, instead it just gives you a 20% chance to double the damage of your next Storm Strike in 10 seconds. Then Lightning Shield has been made a bit more interesting, so whenever you take a melee attack, it gains a charge, and whenever you do a Storm Strike, it gains 2 charges. Then whenever it hits 20 charges, it overcharges, causing you to deal additional damage and generate 100 Maelstrom over 10 seconds, which is pretty cool. That's really all that I feel compelled to talk about with the specific talents, because the main thing that I want to talk about is the role of Maelstrom and just Maelstrom generating talents. They don't feel great right now because we already generate more than we can really use. This knocks a few talents out of the spec, and I think that means it's time for opinions. So the core abilities here, they're all fun to use, right? Like, Chains of Storm Strikes feel cool, Crash Lightning is fantastic, but the devil is in the details. Our resource generation is too high and our resource cap is too low. This makes procs of Storm Strike, which should be our big highlight moment of the spec, be kind of annoying because they lead to resource wastage, because our passive Maelstrom generation from our auto attacks and our Wind Furies is really quite high. And this means that you're often left choosing between, using either any button or Lava Lash to burn off extra resources. And what amazes me here is that Havoc Demon Hunter received similar criticisms from players, but Blizzard quickly bumped its resource cap up to 120, and I really don't know why they don't want to do the same here. it just seems like bringing that up would be a quick fix to many of the feel issues of this spec. It would allow us to have more control over our resources, and it would open up more of those maelstrom generating talents. Finally, a long-standing gripe has been survivability, which currently is not great outside of our 1 cooldown. I'm not really sure what the best solution here is. Maybe, you could have a mechanic that would charge up your next healing surge to be instant and, more powerful. That would be maybe kind of nice. But right now I'd say this. It's a fun enough spec to run around the open world with. I do, however, though, find it quite frustrating to play in contexts where I would care about performance, mostly because of the problems with the resource generation and the overflow of resources, which makes a lot of the talent tree feel undesirable. So overall, I would like to see patch 8.1 increase the maelstrom cap to 120 or 150, and either add in or change a few of the talents to be sort of bigger maelstrom spenders. I think that would make the spec feel a lot better, but one thing that it does kind of lack is like an overarching mechanic with maelstrom only really being thrown into lava lashes, of course, because of the, the Stormbringer change. And again, that Stormbringer change, I don't like it. I'd actually rather that did spend resources. So yeah, it's definitely a very mixed bag when it comes to the Enhancement Shaman. I do think that it actually feels worse in Battle for Azeroth than it did in Legion. Okay, time for the overall opinions. Well, look, I still love Resto, but both of the DPS options are somewhat lacking in comparison to their Legion versions. Blizzard have acknowledged this. They have said that gameplay altering class changes are in the works for patch 8.1. This means that I cannot enthusiastically recommend this spec right now. What I can say is that there is a strong core fantasy, visually, at the center of both specs, but right now the gameplay does not line up particularly well. I'm reasonably sure that by 8.1 they will be significantly improved, but I can't really recommend that, and that knocks the Shaman out of the running for me. That said, if you want to main a healer, Resto is a wonderful pick. So there you go, that is the Shaman class review. Little bit of a sad one, I suppose. Never really the thing that I take joy in, in seeing something where I really feel like it has kind of stepped backwards, but hopefully Blizzard will fix it up in 8.1. So, massive thank you to you for watching, a massive thank you to Icy Veins for supporting this series by sponsoring it, and also, I've been doing these in collaboration with their class writers, which has been such a tremendous help. So, be sure to check out Icy Veins. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.